is Dr. Wayne Neale. To introduce Dr. Neale, may I invite Professor Rahul Abhyankar, who is co-founder and director of faculty at the Institute. Professor Rahul, over to you.
Thank you, Padmaja, and welcome everyone to the Product Leaders webinar series. We have Dr. Wayne Neale today, and I'm very excited to have him engage with the Institute and share his insights and experience with all of us. And I'll introduce Dr. Wayne shortly. Just logistics before we get started. A little bit information about the Institute. The Institute of Product Leadership is a global business school for technology and product people. And we have a variety of programs all the way from 2 or a 3-day workshop to an executive MBA in product leadership. And the next batch of the executive MBA program is starting next month. And we've been very fortunate over the years to work with people from many large companies, small companies, startups, and also very fortunate to engage with senior executives both in India and United States and the world over, and also have very significant university partnerships for hosting and offering our programs. If you'd like to know more about the Institute, we have a number of events coming up, so I'll share information about these events at the end of the webinar. In order to get access to webinar content, if you haven't registered for our Continuous Learning and Access program, CLAP, it's free to sign up on the website, productleadership.com/CLAP. And with that, you get an IPL education account with Google Drive storage, access to content, resources, and a whole lot of goodies and things. So please do take advantage, as many of our alumni and people in the community do. Lots of interesting information continuously updated for continuous learning and access. For 2 webinar attendees, we are giving away a book, a very popular and very interesting book called Inseparable Twins, written by one of our faculty members, Professor Naveen Lakur. Naveen Lakur is a veteran in the area of entrepreneurship and innovation, and he's a very prolific author. So 2 of the attendees here will get a chance to get this book. And in order to do that, make sure that you are interacting, asking a lot of questions. The team here is going to keep track of all the questions, and we'll make those questions come up live at the end of the webinar here. Also, if you are tweeting, the Twitter handle is ProdLeader and #ProdEvents. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Neale, Dr. Wayne Neale, and get into his webinar. One of these people that you rarely come across that have experience in a vast number of areas. In the early part of his career, Dr. Neale ran product management and customer experience at Kodak. From then on, he was vice president of business development and product management at SAP, and he's done a lot of work with a lot of startups that have gone either IPO or acquired. And currently, he is the founding partner of GrowthX Academy, and conducts a lot of programs in user experience, sales and marketing, and growth marketing. So as you can see, someone who's really been there, done it all, and we couldn't be more happier to host Dr. Neale today on this webinar and talk about significant, important tips, especially in the area of UX and design, that product leaders need to know. Dr. Neale, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and welcome. I'd love to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much. Happy to be here. And I assume you can see my screen at this point.
Yes, we can.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here this morning. I love talking about UX design and product management and how they go together, so I hope to get into some of that discussion today, and then any questions around this area as well. You did tell a little bit about my background, and I have been in both product management roles, marketing roles, sales roles, and user experience roles. My educational background was in cognitive psychology and human factors engineering and human-computer interaction. So I started my career with that background, but as in working at many startups, got into leading product management and marketing and other functions. And so it's given me a certain perspective about startups and technology and how to approach product introduction and product management, and building great products that people love, that are useful, and that are desirable for people. So with that said, this talk is called 5 UX Design Tips Every Product Leader Should Know. And let's see, okay. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about, what is UX design. Ironically, as designers that are supposed to bring clarity and simplicity to the world, it's one of the hardest things to explain to people, and it always has been. I'm not sure why all the time, but Don Norman, he's considered the father of user experience, and one of the things he points out is, no product is an island, that a product is a whole set of integrated experiences. So that's one of the big things that have changed in the last 10, 15 years with user experience, is that it used to be that user experience designers would only focus on the screen, and just the elements of the screen, often referred to as the UI, the user interface. But the customer lives beyond the screen. There's a broader context and a broader set of tasks and goals that the user has, and that's what we tend to look at, measure, and design as the entire user experience. And so I often get asked, what's the one book that I should read? And that's why I showed Don Norman here, because The Design of Everyday Things is a book that's nothing about technology, but rather about everyday things, and it's a perfect book to establish a mindset around looking at the world differently and the things that we interact with on a daily basis, and how those things are designed. And you can see from the cover here, this teapot, you have the spout and the handle on the same side, making it really virtually impossible to pour. And no one would design a teapot like that, but in software we have all kinds of teapots in all of our products, and making the interaction with those products confusing and frustrating, and sometimes not even usable. And so one warning with this book, though, it will ruin your life. So I'll put that warning out there, because you'll never look at the world and the things you interact with the same way anymore, and you'll see that design is all around us, and oftentimes things weren't designed with humans in mind and how we interact with things. So one of the questions that always comes up is, what is design versus user experience? And I just call it all design. Design is often the visual layer, the visual graphics that you see on a screen, and this picture sort of points out the big difference between the two. So whoever designed this park, they put in the sidewalks and the lamps, and there's a little brick paver, the circle off to the right, and they made it really look nice, but what they didn't pay attention to was how people would actually use the park. And obviously you can see from the dirt path what people actually do when they come to the park. So, the designer designed the park the way they did. They probably looked at the space, looked at aesthetics, and thought, what's the best way to make this park look really nice? And they probably never even considered how people would use it necessarily, or certainly didn't observe any behavior. So how would a user experience designer approach this park? As a user experience designer, first of all, we would plant grass in the whole park, and then we would come and watch people use it. So we would come in the morning to see if people are using it as they, work out maybe in the morning. We would look at it during lunchtime to see if people were bringing their lunches to the park and maybe sitting under a shade tree. We would come in the evening to see if people were hanging out or, again, running through the park or whatever the case may be. And we would let these dirt paths form as a data layer to tell us, where's the best place to put in the sidewalks. And if you look where that gentleman, I think it's a gentleman, heading on the dirt trail, it looks like a city street there. There may be some restaurants over there, coffee shops, things like that. And of course, that's where people are normally walking to. And so as user experience people, we observe people using things a lot because people will tell you one thing, but they actually do another all the time. And so observing people in their natural environments doing the actual tasks that they're doing is a very good way to understand people and figure out what they want. And we also measure things, collect data. We try to figure out, what people want, who they are, what kind of goals do they have, what their pain points are, and then design experiences based on that knowledge and the insights we get from that kinds of observations and data collection. So another example to stress the point about what user experience is. So again, this is a mountain bike, and I've been recently looking at these, and if you go into a store, someone will help you with the bike, and they'll tell you, all about the frame and the shocks and the brakes and the gears and all the different components and how good they are, and that's really, all about the product. And as product designers, we certainly have to pay attention to things like that. But the user experience is more like this. This is what, the experience is. It's when the product comes together in the wild and how it's used and the experience you get from riding it. And this picture here tells us all about the experience of riding a mountain bike. And as you can see, the actual product is barely visible. And so it's where the product meets the context and meets the person using the product is where you find the user experience. Okay, so what's the return on investment of design? Design can be something that's hard to measure. It's kind of like, marketing. You spend some money here, you spend some money there, and, where did the return really come from? And so one of the things I've looked at is, why is UX design so popular, and why has it become so popular? And you see sort of this is a trend of jobs and postings for UX designer over the years from January 06 to January 15. And you see in 07 and 08 and end of 07 where it really took off as a discipline and a job role. And there's really one reason for that, and that is this, the iPhone. So what happened, and why did that change everything? And the reason is, if you watch, the product launches that Apple used to do and Steve Jobs, they're quite, famous product launches. And if you watch the one on YouTube where he launched the iPhone in 2007, the audience barely reacted like they normally do, because I think at the time they had no idea that the impact that this product would have on the world and people's everyday experience. And so other companies, paid attention to this quite a bit. They asked themselves, how did Apple become the most viable company on the planet? And they attributed it to design. And if you look through their annual report and everything they talk about designing for people. And so many companies out there at that time began to say, we want to be the Apple of our industry. We want to be the Apple of this and the Apple of that. And as they looked at what caused that, what drove that idea and motive was, design. And so people were trying to figure it out. So the discussion about user experience design sort of moved from, the development team and departments into the CEO office in 2007, and it became, strategic to companies and to products and product teams, and hence the explosive job growth. Also here, the Design Management Institute, they keep, this is an index of market capitalization of companies that are considered design-centric. And they've created this index to measure the difference between those companies and the benchmark of the S&P 500. And you can see that there's quite a difference in market capitalization. So there is definitely a bigger picture for the return on investment of design, but certainly there's all kinds of other factors that you can measure, on a day-by-day and project-by-project basis. Since, for example, a lot of products, they never see the light of day, and so if they never get to market, rather, and if if you're designing that and using design methodologies, you have a better chance of actually meeting people's needs and creating something that's valuable for people, and that has a better chance to make it to market. Also, for every dollar invested in design, you get about $100 return on that dollar, just in saving time on development work, either the time it takes to do development or the time to go back and fix problems once a product is launched, and you discover that there are user problems and errors that people are having that could have been fixed in a design process prior to that product being launched, as just a couple of examples. Okay, so what we call the design process is the human-centered design process, HCD. And it's really it's what distinguishes user experience design from any other design discipline, is that it's extremely human-centered and focused. And so I'll show you this one process diagram. If you Google UX design process, you'll see 100 different images and takes on this. And again, it sort of leads to the confusion of the process and what we do, but over the years I've embraced that ambiguity, because design, there's a lot of different people that come to UX design. There's a lot of disciplines that are involved that a UX designer needs to know, or to have a team of people to work with, and there's a lot of diversity in the process. And while this and any other diagram will have a certain amount of order to it, the actual process is a really messy process, and that's part of it. But in general, I think most human-centered design projects follow this general process. And as you can see, it's iterative and human-centered, with the human in the center, and you're constantly interacting with humans at different stages of this process. And so, everything starts with, what is the UX strategy? And that's aligning the user experience strategy with the business and product strategy. The human understanding is probably the key differentiator in our design process, which is, using a whole number of methodologies to figure out, what people want, what their pain points are, what kinds of people they are. If you design for everybody, you're actually designing for no one. And so really understanding your intended, user and your target market, describing those people and the types of people and designing for them specifically and in the context in which they're going to use the product is really important, is actually a differentiator. And often through that process, you begin defining and reframing the problem. So really understanding the problem that you're trying to solve and that the market and these people have is extremely important. And oftentimes through that definition, you're often reframing the original problem into something new and designing a product based on that new definition. Ideation is the creativity part. So the thing I love about UX design is that it uses both sides of your brain. There's a lot of analytics in terms of understanding people and understanding products. There's a lot of creativity in conceptualizing solutions to the problem that you've analyzed or that you're trying to solve for. And so we use a lot of ideation and creative thinking processes to come up with various solution points for the product itself and within the product and all the features it may have. And then there's always a design and prototyping stage. Okay, so now you want to make those ideas and that concept visible. And again, all these circles refer to the iteration. So we want to design and test with people and test with stakeholders, and then refine that design and test again, and then refine it, a couple times until the data shows that you're meeting the objectives that you set in the strategy phase. So, and then finally and ultimately, there's usability testing and validation, where you're validating all the assumptions you've had about the product, about the people, and how they would use the product and the benefit they would get from it. You also are doing usability testing to make sure that your interface is intuitive, that people find the product easy to use, and that it can be delightful if that's one of your goals, or efficient or convenient, or whatever the goals were for the product. So what kind of roles constitute UX design? So I'll show you the different roles in a minute. This is an idea of the various disciplines that are involved in user experience design. So you see in this illustration that you have disciplines like industrial design, human factors, which is one of the fields I study. You have sound design, you have human-computer interaction, which is a mix of computer science as well as engineering and psychology. You have interaction design, visual design, obviously, architecture, information architecture. And so all of these disciplines contribute to user experience design, and you're often using various techniques and ideas from all of these disciplines to create a great user experience. The roles in design can also be quite confusing sometimes. There's a number of roles listed here, but a couple of them seem to be the more popular ones. The first one being the user research. So those are the ones that do the human understanding part of the human-centered design process. So they're often in charge of the research and going out and talk to people, doing field studies, doing ethnography, doing usability testing. They're really representing the user and the life that they live, and using empathy to really walk in their shoes and really understand where they're coming from and who they are and what insights they gather so that you can design for them. The other sort of main role is what I call the user experience designer, which might be more the interaction designer on this illustration. They're the people that take the insights from the research and convert those into sketches, into wireframes, into prototypes, using a process of iteration, usually going from lower fidelity mock-ups to higher fidelity prototypes where you can actually test those prototypes where they look and feel like real software and users can interact with it, and you can test that interaction to see how well your design is going. Visual designer is another big role. Obviously, they're coming in at some point, more towards the end of the process typically, and applying the final, visual design, graphic design, layout, incorporating, brand strategy and style guides, etc., to make the product align with the brand and to make it, look really nice, and also contribute to the user experience in a way that they lay out the screens and can use various psychological principles to help the user navigate a system, for example. UX strategist is a role that's emerged over the last 10 or so years, and again, that is mainly due to the role that user experience design plays in the company. More and more, you're seeing roles like chief design officer, chief design strategist, and they're C-level roles where they're developing design and user experience strategies that align with business strategy. So that's sort of the role of that position. Content strategists, they're often doing their copy editing and selecting all the content that might go either into a product or a web app or whatever the case may be. And there's a couple other roles listed here as well. All right, so there are three core tenets to the human-centered design process that I wanted to cover. The first one is being, human understanding. So if I were to pick, what are the three most important things to human-centered design, this would be one of them. Again, it's really, since it's a human-centered design philosophy and discipline, of course, using methodologies to understand people is at the core of that methodology. And I often say that, while programmers and developers deal with very complex coding structures and mathematics, that the human is by far the most complex person and element component in that entire system. So the people that try to figure out what's inside of people's heads and why they behave the way they do, why they'll spend money sometimes and not the other times, for example, why they turn left instead of right, and all kinds of things, is a very complex undertaking. And we can't cut people's heads open and understand what's going on inside there, so we use these indirect methods to try to figure people out and learn so that we can optimize the foundation for a user experience by building a product that takes this understanding into consideration. The second core tenet would be iterative design. So I've run into a lot of designers in my career that are given some product specs and then they just sit down and design a solution, and maybe they get a little feedback and make a couple tweaks and they're done. And that is no way to design a product. And so this process of designing and putting something visual out into the world, prototyping that product and then testing it, and doing that as a loop as you get more feedback, has proven through research study after research study that you get a better design the more you iterate. And so no matter how good of a designer you are, no matter how well you've done your research, that initial design is going to be insufficient. And you need to test it and get that feedback and continue to iterate it until it's at a performance level that is satisfactory for the team and the company. And the third key tenet is evaluation and validation. So human-centered design, at the end of the day, is a scientific process. It's also a creative process, but there are a number of evaluation techniques that we use and data collection, data synthesis and analysis, and results that we're constantly testing our products with. And the main form of testing is usability testing that's been around for years and years and years, and that's a series of techniques and a method to evaluate your design as objectively as possible, again, to ensure that actual people can use it, find value out of it, and in some cases it's a pleasurable and even a meaningful experience to their life. If you think about the smartphone that you carry in your pocket, that product goes beyond just the UI, beyond just the functional and the convenience attributes of that product. It really has deep meaning in our lives. A lot of people wake up with that device and go to bed with it, unfortunately, and use it throughout the day. So we can't really imagine a world where we didn't have these phones anymore. And so that's sort of the impact that design can have on a human experience. So what are the 5 UX design tips that I would recommend for any product manager? And the first would be know thy users, the context, and the problem intimately. And I've sort of mentioned this a couple times already, but almost, if one thing is left out of projects that I've seen over the years, it's the research to really understand the users and the context and the problem that they have. And yet this is the core differentiator to the process. So I would never skip this part. And Einstein had this saying, I think he was maybe one of the original design thinkers, that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. And solutions is plural. And so why is this profound? Well, if you've ever studied a problem, and I call it falling in love with the problem, right? If you only look at a problem at a surface level, and maybe your team has a different understanding, amongst the team people have different views about the problem, then your solution is always going to be substandard. And so the more you study the problem, and that also means the people that are using that device, product, system, service, whatever the case may be, the better you understand that, the better your solutions are going to be. And so why is solutions plural? Well, in a design thinking context, we always want to explore multiple plausible solutions before we just pick one solution and go down that path, because the mistake in doing that is that you can leave out solutions or ideas that will better solve the problem if you just pick that one solution and begin to go down the path of solving the problem that one way. I'll talk more about that in a second. And this is an example of looking at the context of a problem. So before I co-founded GrowthX Academy, I ran a user experience design consultancy that I founded. And this was a project we did for a university. And it was in the College of Education. And when you're studying to be an educator, you have to go out into schools and do something that they call field experience. So you had to go sit in classrooms and just observe teachers in classrooms, and you had to go do that at a number of schools. So when this student came in, just this process, so the process went like this, right? You're a student, you're being trained to be an educator, and you had this requirement to go out and observe classrooms, and you had to do it in more than one school. You had to go to a number of schools. And so to do that, this individual had to interact with all of these people. There were academic counselors, and these were university staff people, and enrollment advisors, EPS on the left, where people specialized in finding opportunities for these students to go observe classrooms. They also had faculty members, a supervisor, as well as their educational faculty. They had technology and documentation they had to use. Their teachers and principals at those schools, they had to interact, they had to get permission from the principals, they had to go into the classrooms and deal with teachers, they had to write up their observation, and the teachers had to sign off on it. And after going to 10 schools, this long document, they had to find a way to upload it into the system. And so what we found out with this very simple process, that this one student interacted with, a dozen people, getting phone calls, emails, PowerPoints, documents, Word documents, different systems, just to do something very simple. And so we discovered all of this through research by going and meeting with students, interviewing those students, meeting with staff, and as we met with them, we again would ask questions about the systems they use, the process they use, and discovered that the overall experience was so overwhelming for the students, and it was a major point of dissatisfaction in their overall student experience. And so this is an example of really understanding the problem in a lot of detail, the whole context of which they experience this problem, how they interact, where they get the information, who do they talk to, and also when, right? When they first sign up for this college, they're told about it, and then they interact with teachers, and then they interact with systems, and then they interact with specialists that help them get these assignments. So at each point in time, they interact with different people, and guess what? All the information is different. So it's very confusing, often conflicting. Some teachers would take it into their own hands to make videos to explain how this worked. So they got informal knowledge, as well as a wiki where they would go on. There was a different set of knowledge. Oftentimes that information was out of date. So very frustrating. But in understanding the problem in a deep way like this, we were able to come up with solutions to streamline this process, to reduce the amount of information and people they interacted with, and to time when they got certain information, when they interacted with people, put all the information in one version of the truth in a single location where they could access it, etc. So we couldn't really design a good solution until we really understood the problem. So the second UX design tip would be align your UX strategy with your product and business strategy. And so a UX strategy is really, it really makes sure that the designers and the team that are working towards that product and UX strategy are aligned with the business. And as designers, as product managers, we can build a great product that people love and is easy to use. But if a company can't make money and make a profit off that product, then there's really no point in doing it. And so, that's another big thing that's changed in UX design over the last 10 years is an understanding of business and business principles. Business acumen is critical to being a designer today, and to always have that business side and set of questions and objectives that align with your UX strategy. And so, there's a business strategy which leads to a product strategy which leads to an experience strategy. And so oftentimes the UX strategist is the leader or the manager of the design group, and they work closely with product managers and the business to make sure that the UX strategy is aligning to that process, and that designers have methodologies and facilitation techniques to be inclusive of these people and these strategies to make sure that their team are aware of what the objectives are, and that they use that information in the design, because it's as much about interacting with humans and the users of the product as it is interacting with your own company and business to make sure that those goals are aligned. So the third tip would be, facilitate the design process across functions and companies. And I sort of just alluded to that. This is another big change that happened in UX design over the last 10 years as well. It used to be that very similar to graphic designers, UX designers were giving a product specification or maybe a product requirements document or marketing requirements document, and they went over in the corner and sat at their desktop and designed a workflow and a UX design along with graphic design to design this product. And that's just not no longer the case anymore. Often now the design teams are facilitating the design process across the functions in the company. So there are methods and processes where product managers and developers and product owners and CEOs even are part of this process and part of solving the problem, and it's the designer's role to facilitate that process, to use design thinking and design thinking methodologies and human-centered design methodologies to get the best design, because designers don't have all of that information in their heads. They rely on all the knowledge in the company and should tap into that knowledge, but using design methods and processes that will generate great ideas and generate great products and generate great designs, giving that product the best chance to be successful in the company and in the market. And so oftentimes you'll have scenes like this, right? So this is part of what I said, the process diagrams always look nice and clean, but the actual process is a lot messier. And you can see here sort of screenshots and sticky notes and arrows going in every direction, and a team of people sitting around trying to solve all of these little problems. And all the 6 or 7 boards represent maybe the entire product, or maybe only one workflow of the product. And these people and designers should be, again, guiding the whole team through this process. And I love the way, and this is a very good way to make those ideas as they're being formed visible, so that you can get stakeholder feedback and you can bring teams through and executives that won't be working on it all day like you are as a designer or a product leader, involved in the process, and bring their knowledge and opinions and point of view to a particular problem, whether that problem be a single feature, whether it be an entire workflow or the entire product itself. So that role of the designer to facilitate this process and to tap into everyone's knowledge on the team is a key role and process that should be done. So tip number 4, develop the right design before making the design right. And this is something that Bill Buxton out of Microsoft and the University of Toronto really has expressed in a book called Sketching the User Experience. And what he means by this is sort of what I talked about before, is that when you're given a certain problem, you want to come up with multiple plausible solutions for that design. And that's the part about developing the right design. So you want to make sure it's the right design to the problem, it's the right solution to the problem before you begin making the design right. In other words, before you begin iterating and optimizing on your single solution and ultimate final solution, you want to explore multiple solutions. And it sort of looks like this in a simplistic way. right? If you start on the far left, that's your problem and where your starting point is. And each branch represents a different plausible solution to that problem. And you want to explore all the different variants of that solution before you zero in on the ultimate solution. And so we use techniques called divergent thinking and convergent thinking. And divergent thinking is about exploration, about ideation and creativity and finding ideas and solutions to problems. And convergent thinking is about making choices. It's about eliminating some of those ideas. So ultimately, you do have to make the design right. The interesting thing about this process is you want to be creative and you want to come up with even bizarre and silly ideas, solutions to the product idea. And they ultimately won't work, but by doing that exercise, you do find little nuggets of gold and ideas that you explored down one path that you'll ultimately use in the final process. So this is a very a good way to come up with the best solution and the best idea. And so we call it, going slow to go fast, is make sure you spend the time to do this rather than, it's very easy to just pick one of these solutions and start, running with it rather than exploring multiple plausible solutions. Okay, and so tip number 5 is design the process of doing design in your organization. And so what I mean by that is sometimes there are companies that focus more on, getting design and the process of doing design in your company is more important sometimes than the product design itself. And what I mean by that, so this book I've listed here by my friend and colleague Peter Merholtz, Org Design for Design Orgs, and it's a great book that just came out, and it's about how different organizational designs work inside of companies to create great design organizations, like the one that I listed on that market capitalization chart. So how do you design into your organization? So as designers, we come up with ideas and solutions for designing the process of design into the organization. And that can be, for example, anything from, a central organization. So you have one central design organization, and then people are assigned out to different projects. And this, of course, all depends on the size of the company. Another model is to have a completely distributed design organization where there is no central organization, but all the designers are sitting out and on product teams. And then there's a hybrid approach where you do have a central design organization, but people sit on design teams, but also come together and to share ideas and learnings and process as part of a central organization. And there's a number of variants in between those different alternatives. And so it's worth paying attention to because, again, not everyone understands or even cares what the design process is, but everyone cares about and wants to build a great product, and they want to be successful. And it's just as important, I think, as designing how design gets done in your company as it is, doing the design just for the product. So paying attention to both is very important. So I think with that is my last slide. I want to thank you for taking the time today to listen to this, and I think we have time for some questions if there are any.
Yes, Dr. Wayne, thank you so much, and great information. I think you gave us about 2 or 3 books, and I know that a lot of our participants are avid book readers, and they will get their hands on those books as soon as they can. I'm pretty sure about that. We do have a few questions that have come in, and some of them came on the questions channel. Some came as private questions to me. So let me just quickly share those questions with you. Balaji has a question about, it's an interesting question about ergonomics. And typically we look at the design process and problem space that you talked about as, understanding their needs. And you gave the example of the iPhone. And there have been recent studies that show that when, kids and teenagers look down into their iPhones or iPads, there is about 60 pounds of pressure on the neck. And so this aspect about, how easy is it for people to use something, not just from a standpoint of the workflow, but from the ergonomic aspect of the devices and the products that we use. How do we go about looking at those?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I can see that. I look at people sitting at workstations too, and ergonomically they're set up almost all the times wrong, which causes stress, on the body and reduces your performance and your enjoyment, and can cause long-term injury to your body, like carpal tunnel syndrome, for example. So I think one of the things I said, and Don Norman, on his quote on I think it was the first slide maybe, that the product is more than just the product, it's the entire system and environment in which you use it. So I will bet a lot of money that Apple did not think about the consequence of people using their phones and looking down all the time and causing this stress on the neck muscles and the spine and the tendons in that area, because they were going to be so popular and be used every day. I bet you they never ever thought of that, and it was something that came later. So an easy way, now that would have been a hard thing to measure, and oftentimes in the user research we get challenged with, how do we measure certain things? And so how would you, before the iPhone was invented, how would you anticipate, how would you prototype something that, we didn't know how people would use that device so much every day? And then, if you were just to observe people like we can today, we can go out to a mall or a street corner or a bus and see everyone hunched over on their phones, and realize that that's not a good thing. I think the iWatch, when they launched that, was one, they often stress, now you don't have to get your phone out. Now you don't have to look at your phone. You can just glance at your watch. And so I think the solution to that question is to, make sure that you understand the entire environment and context and the entire system, not just one element of the system, which is the product. And hopefully you'll be able to discover those kinds of unintended consequences that pop up when we introduce things to the world.
Yeah, and maybe it might be difficult to anticipate the usage and the pattern of usage for the 1.0, but successive iterations could possibly measure the way in which those devices are used, potentially.
Definitely.
Yeah. Have another question here from Riti, and she says, typically, especially in the Indian context where the engineering and product development happens to be a little bit remote and removed from the end users, have you been in situations, Dr. Wayne, where the user community is not locally close to proximate where you are, and how do you still take advantage of figuring out what do they need and how they are going to kind of factor into this design thinking process?
Yeah. So that is definitely oftentimes a challenge. I wrote one of the very first research papers on remote usability testing in the early 90s, before the web was invented. And so today we can use systems like GoToWebinar and other web conferencing systems to do remote testing. And so I've done that a number of times, where you can get people to sign up. If your product happens to be digital or on the web or accessible through the computer, you can capture what's happening on the screen as well as use a webcam to capture their face, which is a typical setup for a usability test, where you're looking at the screen and looking at the person's face to see their expressions and expressions of confusion or delight or whatever the case may be. And that tends to work pretty well, and it's a pretty good methodology, because usability testing is often done in a lab, and that's a very unnatural environment. And even though they may be, you know, sitting in their home talking to you on a web conference and interacting with you, it's still a little bit more natural environment to them, and you get a little bit better data. So that's one method.
Yeah, and we would love to get a link to that paper so we can share it with the community on the LinkedIn group. But how about, Dr. Wayne, on the front end of that process, where we're trying to understand users, the personas, you know, their life and how our product might fit into their life or the challenges that they have. Do you have to be face-to-face, or can you do something, or there are ways to do this remotely?
Yeah. Well, if you look at ethnography, there's sort of three general techniques. One is observation, where you just observe users in a natural environment. And typically you have to be there with them, although, you know, depending on the situation, you could still use video. The other one is to immerse yourself in that environment and experience it yourself. And so you're also observing, but you're actually a part of the environment now. So obviously you have to be there for that. The other one, the third part of ethnography, is engagement. And that's where you engage with people. And interviewing people is one of the key techniques in ethnography and user experience design. And I've done that, you know, hundreds of times remotely. And that's usually through web conferencing, where you can just, you know, interact with a person for an hour. And there's very specific questioning techniques to really get at, you know, and get deep understanding of the problem and the person and the situation. And those can be very effective. But there's nothing like being there, so I think oftentimes it's better to take a small team, usually 2 people, and travel to the place that is of concern to you.
Yeah, that would be, you know, obviously a good luxury to have. In some cases, we may not have that. So the aspect that you mentioned, the third part about, you know, using web conferencing as a technique to interview users, you know, again, similar to the article that you talked about, would be great if you can share, you know, a link or two, and the team can share it with the community here on LinkedIn. One other question. I know we are getting to the close to the end of the webinar here, but I think this is a very interesting question. And you know, the question is from Hemant about the balance between the best design and how cost-effective it is. And so how do you strike that balance, and how do you draw the line where you know, there is a, in addition to just the ROI side of it, you know, how do you make sure that the design is efficient from a cost standpoint?
Right, and by cost, I assume that it's the cost of the designers and the time that they take to come up with the design. Is that the assumption?
So there are 2 aspects to it. One is the time that it takes to come up with the design, and the second is the cost of the design itself. You know, some designs may be cost prohibitive. Like, for instance, you know, having Gorilla Glass on the iPhone, the first iPhone, might have been cost prohibitive.
Right. Yeah. Well, the wonderful thing about design is that we're always given constraints, and you really need constraints when you design. So that's part of the UX strategy and the business strategy, is that before you begin a project, you really need to understand the constraints. And so if cost is one of those constraints, then you have to design with that constraint in mind. So that's very important. I sort of alluded to it in terms of just the cost of designers and the time that they use and their methods, and there's a whole, you know, series of opinions and ideas on, you know, how to, for instance, integrate design into agile methodologies, and so there is a time and an efficient, there's a very efficient way to do design, but I can't tell you the amount of money is saved. Like, you know, within 2 or 3 weeks, you could do a design sprint that included the whole team, explore all these ideas, explore the problem, prototype the solution, test the solution, and really have a really good start to the design in just 2 weeks before you've written a line of code. And the amount of money that saves, because again, teams, they want to start coding right away and get going and get that product out. But just spending even a couple weeks with the whole team, you know, going through these design methodologies that I alluded to, can save hundreds of thousands of dollars. Just in, you know, as soon as you write some code, it's very difficult to reverse that code and do something different. And so with prototyping and evaluating those prototypes and iterating designs, you can design out a lot of those problems that you're going to have if you don't do that, if you just start coding a product. So the ROI on the time spent, to me, is a no-brainer. It's been proved over and over and over again. But there's certainly the design constraints, you know, around cost for, like, you know, product development is something that needs to be taken into consideration, and the design solution has to take that constraint into account and design, you know, for something as good as they can given that constraint.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And, you know, we still have some questions coming in, and I'll take one more question because a lot of people seem to have this one, which is, you know, what is the future of design thinking, especially when we look at, you know, the technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, virtual reality, augmented reality, you know, a lot of different things on the horizon. So how do we see design thinking and user experience, customer experience evolving? What's your crystal glass, say, for the next 10 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, you hear this term Internet of Things, right? Where our whole physical environment is going to be computerized and we'll be interacting with it. And, you know, some of that exists already today, of course. And I always call it the Internet of People rather than the Internet of Things. And it shifts the focus to the people. And in some ways, I think the future is more about the evolution and more broadly adopted thinking and problem-solving techniques in human-centered design and design thinking, rather than anything that's going to change about that. What changes is all the technologies which you mentioned, and, you know, we're going to have speech interfaces, and we're going to have, you know, autonomous robots and all the and autonomous cars, which I've worked on. And the really key, again, to me, is that more and more people use design thinking and are trained on that and experience it, so that we take the human into consideration in all of these technologies. And while technology can be exciting for technology's sake, if a person can't use it and it doesn't solve the problems, then again, it's not really that great of a technology. And so to me, the future is a future where everyone is using design thinking as just part of what they do, as opposed to some specialized group that's going to help us with this thing.
Excellent. And I loved what you said about the Internet of People, more so than the Internet of Things. It just you know, resonates very well and brings the human and the people center, rather than, you know, just trying to connect things, right?
Right.
Love it. Yeah,
exactly.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dr. Wayne. That was very insightful. And again, for you know, other questions that we may not have gotten to due to lack of time, we will get those questions posted and answered here on the LinkedIn group. So join the Product Leaders Consortium group on LinkedIn. Let me look at who are the two winners here. Okay, the team has you know, identified, these are random picks, Rajesh Roy and Subramanyam Yeleshwarapu. You know, the team will contact you to get your information and get you a copy of this book each. So congratulations on winning the book. So thanks everyone for joining the webinar. We'll have additional webinars come up, and you'll get to know about them. In the meantime, we have some seminars and events that are coming up. February 4th, if you are in Pune, we have a one-day seminar, Day in the Life of a Product Manager, with executives from Pune and our faculty members there to talk about product leadership, product management. Dr. Andrew Bean from Australia will be our pleasure to host him for the next webinar on how do we understand our power to negotiate. And this is something that's very critical of a product leader as we are managing stakeholders and getting to the right decisions in the right context. And then March 4th in Bangalore, we have another seminar, The Day in the Life of a Product Manager, and we'll be hosting Himanshu Parsule, who's traveling to Bangalore just for this event, and he's changed his schedule from Australia and his other travels to be in Bangalore for this event. He's the Chief Technology Officer of Epicor. So we'll be looking forward to hosting all of you there as well. And once again, thank you so much for being part of this webinar. Dr. Wayne, really appreciate you taking the time to be here and share your experience and insights. And thanks all once again. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.